Hello, I'm glad you could join me in my study today. Last time, we talked about the various metaphors and motifs that characterize the death of Christ in the New Testament. And I said that out of all of the various ways in which the death of Christ is characterized, the predominant motif, far above all others, is the motif of Jesus' death as a sacrificial offering to God. The New Testament writers and Jesus himself saw Jesus' death in light of the Old Testament sacrifices, including the Passover sacrifice and the daily sacrifices prescribed in the tabernacle and then later in the temple in the book of Leviticus, as well as the Day of Atonement sacrifice. And these sacrifices served principally two functions. First, they served to appease or placate God's wrath. It was dangerous having a holy God living in your midst. His wrath could break out at sin at any moment and destroy the people. And so one of the functions of the sacrifices was to placate or appease God's wrath, to protect the people from his holiness. We see this, for example, in the Passover sacrifice, where the blood of the sacrifice on the doorsteps of the Israelite people protected them from the wrath of God and the judgment of God that swept over Egypt. The Passover lamb's blood was like a storm cellar in the midst of the tornado of God's judgment that swept over Egypt. And then in the Levitical sacrifices as well, one of the functions of these sacrifices was to appease God's wrath so that the people, though unclean and sinful, could live with a holy God in their very midst. This function of sacrifice is called propitiation by theologians. God's wrath is propitiated or appeased by the sacrifices. But the sacrifices also did something else, all very significant. They served to cleanse the people of sin and uncleanness before God so that he could live in their midst. They were a way of removing the sins and the uncleanness of the people. And this is called expiation. Sin is taken away or removed. So these sacrifices served two functions. They propitiated God's wrath and they expiated sin. And Jesus' death similarly is described in this way by the New Testament authors. They saw Jesus' death as both propitiatory of God's wrath and judgment and also as expiatory of our sin before God.